So today I'm going to go through how we handle Mythic Argus, both how to survive and what kind of strat we're using for our tanks. So the first thing I want to give you a heads up on is my UI, a few things you might want to keep an eye on if you're interested in what I am doing. First of all, I have a rotational add-on which shows you what skills and cooldowns I am pressing. And my weak auras, the most important being shield block and ignore pain trackers, which you can see here. So for any one of you who's wondering, well, what class should I play? Doesn't really matter. As long as you're comfortable in the tank you're playing, you'll be fine. So let's take a quick look on how to survive Mythic Argus Phase 1. The first thing you want to get used to is his sight timings. He has a few different cast sequences for them, meaning that your DBM or bigwig timers can't really be trusted, but you will get used to this after a few tries. These weird timings will continue out through the entire fight, so just stay on your toes. Secondly, you want to make sure you survive, and this part is pretty straightforward if you've gotten used to his timings. His melee swings in Phase 1 doesn't do much damage, and his sights are easy to survive as long as you have your active mitigation up, be it shield block, demon spikes, you name it. If you need to take more than 2 sights, make sure to have a cooldown for it along with your active mitigation just to be safe. So as soon as you've gotten used to his timings, we can focus a bit more on step 3, which is positioning. And depending on what tactic your guild is running, this could differ a lot. The tactic we're running with is pretty straightforward. We bait the cones behind the boss and backpedal a few steps, leaving a little space between the boss and his last cone, so the raid can bait the next one. So the last thing you want to get a hang of in Phase 1 is keeping your buff up. And it's a bit tricky when you're tanking to snag them all, but as I previously stated, if you get used to his timings, getting the buffs will be a lot easier. So what we usually do is, whoever starts tanking Argus always takes 3 sights. This will allow both tanks to have a good amount of time to take their first buff. So for the second buff, you simply wait until he starts casting his cone. Doesn't matter if you're tanking him or not, he will always cast Tortured Rage after his second cone, which leaves you just enough time to run and snag the second buff. The third buff usually lines itself with the second or third sight on whichever tank is currently tanking. So if you're not tanking, take the buff, then taunt the boss. And if you are tanking, just wait for the other tank to take the boss, and then you run and get your buff. And the same thing goes for the fourth buff. It either lines up with the second or the third sight. And as you can see here, the fourth buff dropped during his second sight, so I pick up the buff and I wait for the third sight, and then I taunt the boss. So as long as you get used to his timings and communicate with your other tank, you should be fine. And that's pretty much it for Phase 1. So, how do we handle Phase 2? The key part of Phase 2 is the Avatar of Agramar buff, and how to handle it. The very first buff will always be given to the tank that's tanking at the start of Phase 2. We went with a monk here, because Stagger and Senemed is pretty overpowered for handling the bombs. After that is where it gets a little bit tricky. Either one of the 2 tanks that didn't get the Avatar buff the first time can now get it. So how do we deal with that? We simply have both the tanks who can get the buff start running to the middle of the room, and whoever gets the buff uses the gateway we have there to get to the healer that has the bomb. And as you can see here, I start running towards the middle, having my heroic leap up just in case I am the one who gets the buff. And as soon as I see that it's on the other tank, I run back to the boss. So how do I survive the bomb if I get it? As a protection warrior, I pretty much use everything that is available. Shield wall, last stand and spell reflect, but this will differ depending on the class you're playing. And that's pretty much it for Phase 2, just get used to how the Avatar of Agramar buff works and make sure you survive. And now for my favorite part, Phase 3. So how you handle Phase 3 will differ a bit depending on what tactic you're going for. So we're suiciding on the second chain, which is a pretty common strat. And we always use 3 tanks to make Phase 3 as easy as possible, and this is due to Rent Soul. So how does Rent Soul work? Well, for every stack of Soul Rending Sight a tank survives, an orb will spawn. Meaning if you take 4 sights, 4 orbs will spawn. But if you die on the 5th sight, no orbs will spawn. Which is why we always try to die on the 5th one. We have 2 tanks tanking the boss and swapping on every 5th site. 1 tank dies, the other tank steps in, etc. And we have our 3rd tank picking up the orbs so they don't hit anyone else in the raid. So before we suicide, we usually go with 1 tank taking 5 stacks, 2nd one 5 stacks, and 3rd one taking 2 to 3 stacks, just to ensure that whichever tank is up when the rest suicide has a low amount of stacks, making it far easier to survive when you're all alone and afraid. So how do I survive up to 4 or more sites? Well, this will largely depend on what class you're running. As a warrior, my biggest focus is to make sure I have shield block up for each and every site, seeing how that is the biggest defensive you can have against it. I usually start weaving in CDs like Demo Shout and Last Stand on the 2nd or 3rd site, and save Neltarian's Fury for the 4th, or in rare cases, to survive a 5th one. So Neltarian's Fury guaranteed that you crit block any melee attacks during its channel, and it is by far the strongest defensive you have against his sites. However, when I tank Argus during the suicide, I pretty much pop most of my cooldowns while everyone else is dead, because I know I will get back at least Demo Shout until the 3rd or 4th site, and I still have my Neltarian's Fury, and for overkill we usually have our Disc Priest PSing me before he dies. And that is it for Phase 3 and Mythic Argus, arguably the best fight as a tank in Antorus. And if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask in the comments below. And please like, comment and subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.